organised they believe we are, the less likely they are to call that second referendum. I hope it's not needed, but I'm pessimistic, and I believe that it may. And I'll tell you, as I said in the video, if I have to fight again against this lot, then believe me, next time, as far as I'm concerned, it's no more
Huge conspiracy. Ed Milliband conspires with Reform UK to take revenge against Starmer. Ed Milliband, Labour's shadow climate secretary and long-time proponent of the UK's net zero policy, has made an impassioned plea for Reform UK leaders Nigel Farage and Richard Tice to reconsider their party's stance on climate action. Reform, a party gaining traction in recent polls, has vowed to scrap the government's net zero commitments, calling them economically damaging, unrealistic, and deeply unpopular with working-class voters. Milliband, known for introducing the UK's original Climate Change Act in 2008, urged Reform to reverse its opposition to decarbonisation, calling their rhetoric dangerous and reckless. He argued that abandoning the net zero goal would harm Britain's economy, damage its global standing, and accelerate the climate crisis. The call, however, has been met with sharp criticism and ridicule from Reform-aligned figures and parts of the public who view Milliband's record on energy policy as flawed and hypocritical. Among the chief criticisms are accusations that Labour's green strategy relies too heavily on imported technologies, particularly Chinese-made solar panels, which some critics claim could pose national security concerns. Critics argue that Milliband's policies prioritize ideological goals over practical concerns such as energy independence and affordability. Reform's promise to restart North Sea oil and gas exploration under the slogan, "Drill, baby, drill," has found support among voters frustrated with high energy bills and skeptical of the costs associated with renewable infrastructure. Despite his plea, there is little indication that Reform will soften its position. The party has been unequivocal. Net zero is off the table. Richard Tice has repeatedly described the policy as economic suicide, while Nigel Farage has called it a con trick, citing the growing public backlash over energy price hikes. Electric vehicle mandates and heating regulations tied to climate goals, while Milliband maintains that transitioning to a green economy is both achievable and necessary. The political momentum appears to be shifting. Polls suggest growing fatigue, with climate policies perceived as elitist, especially in areas still recovering from economic stagnation. Reform is betting on this sentiment, presenting itself as the only party telling the truth about net zero's costs. Fueling further skepticism are questions about the personal and financial interests behind Britain's renewable push. Critics have pointed to the rapid growth of companies tied to political insiders, raising concerns about cronyism. While there's no direct evidence linking Milliband to improper dealings, the broader sense of mistrust in Westminster remains a challenge for those championing green policies. Milliband's detractors have not been shy in voicing their disdain. Some political commentators have labeled him as politically tone-deaf, accusing him of pushing unpopular policies in pursuit of a legacy rather than genuine public benefit. Among his harshest critics, he has been derided as out of touch, with one online pundit claiming, if he thinks he can sway Farage and Tice, he's delusional. Reform will laugh him out of the room. The political theater surrounding net zero is now central to the next general election, with parties clashing over its future. While the Conservatives remain officially committed to it, albeit with delays and adjustments, Labour has pledged to accelerate green initiatives. Reform, by contrast, has framed its opposition as a core part of its identity, drawing a stark line in the sand for Milliband. This moment is critical. He is trying to defend policies built over a decade ago in a radically changed political climate. Energy insecurity rising inflation, and growing public disillusionment have shifted the national conversation. Where once green policies were seen as progressive and forward-looking, they are now increasingly viewed through the lens of cost and control. Still, Milliband insists that climate leadership is not optional. Britain must not walk away from our environmental responsibilities, he said in a recent interview. The world is watching, but reform doesn't appear to care what the world is watching. They're watching voters, especially in marginal and traditionally labor seats, who are fed up with energy bills, heat pump mandates, and what they see is top-down governance from metropolitan elites. If Milliband's seat is at risk, as some polling suggests, then the stakes are personal as well as political. Whether or not he survives the next election, his green legacy now hangs in the balance, challenged by a party that has turned net zero into a battleground and is refusing to back down. Milliband's uphill battle to defend net zero highlights a deeper divide in British politics, one that goes beyond energy policy and into the heart of cultural identity, class resentment, and trust in institutions. Reform UK has tapped into a growing frustration, particularly among working class and rural voters, who feel excluded from decision-making and burdened by policies made for urban elites. In that context, Ed Miliband's call for reform to reconsider its stance on net zero sounds less like a debate and more like a collision between two irreconcilable worldviews. Milliband represents the traditional technocratic establishment, believing in long-term planning, international cooperation, and multilateral environmental agreements. His argument is built on the premise that climate change is a global emergency requiring coordinated, sustained action, and that the UK has both a moral duty and an economic opportunity to lead that transition. But reform and its growing base of supporters reject that premise outright. For them, net zero represents not a solution, but a problem, a policy imposed without consent, driven by ideology, and carried out with little regard for the immediate financial strain it places on ordinary households. While Milliband talks about renewable investments and future-proofing the economy, reform talks about sovereignty, affordability, and energy realism, and crucially, reform is finding an audience. The UK's net zero targets, once seen as a cross-party consensus, are now becoming a wedge issue. Local protests over low-traffic neighborhoods, ultra-low-emission zones (ULEZ), and restrictions on boilers and vehicles have spilled over into national politics. Many voters now see green policies not as solutions to a shared crisis, but as symbols of overreach, bureaucracy, and nanny-state politics. That's the context in which Milliband's appeal falls flat. To those who view him as a relic of failed government experiments and liberal groupthink, his warnings feel more like scolding than leadership. His past record, including the infamous 2013 energy price freeze proposal later ridiculed, then adopted in modified form by the Conservatives, and Labour's previous support for unpopular green taxes, is constantly thrown back at him for reform. This is politically golden. The more Labour defends net zero with wonkish precision, the more space it leaves for populists to brand themselves as defenders of the working man. Drill, baby, drill may lack nuance, but it's a message people understand, especially when faced with winter fuel bills and talk of rolling blackouts. And there's another element adding fuel to this fire: geopolitics. Reform supporters point to the reliance on Chinese technology, including solar panels and battery storage systems, as a security risk. The idea that parts of the UK's green infrastructure could be compromised by decisions made in Beijing is, to them, intolerable. Milliband's critics have seized on this, accusing him of being complicit in selling off Britain's energy future to foreign powers. While these claims are often exaggerated, they reflect a broader anxiety that in trying to save the planet, Britain may be sacrificing too much of its own control and identity. Reform's position may be blunt, but in today's political climate, bluntness is a feature, not a flaw. As the general election looms, this debate will only intensify. Labour will double down on its climate promises, especially under pressure from its left-leaning base and the Green Party. The Tories will likely hedge, trying to keep business interests on side while appeasing a public weary of new costs. But Reform has the advantage of clarity. No to net zero, yes to oil and gas, and yes to what it calls energy common sense. If Ed Miliband is hoping to win over Farage and Tice with reasoned argument and moral appeals, he's almost certainly wasting his time. Reform's opposition to net zero isn't about facts, it's about feeling, about control, about rebellion. And while Milliband may laugh off the idea that Reform could ever shape the future of energy policy, the political winds are shifting. More and more voters are asking whether Britain's climate leadership is worth the price. Reform is ready with a simple answer. Milliband, for all his experience and knowledge, may not have one the public wants to hear. In the end, it won't be think tanks or parliamentary speeches that decide this issue. It will be voters. And as things stand, it's not Ed Miliband they're listening to. As this political tug-of-war over net zero continues, it exposes not only the policy divides between parties, but a much deeper crisis of confidence in Britain's political class. Ed Miliband, as the face of Labour's climate agenda, has become a lightning rod for that frustration. To his supporters, he's a long-standing advocate for a sustainable future, trying to guide the country toward a cleaner, greener economy. To his detractors, especially those backing Reform, he embodies everything wrong with modern politics. Detached, doctrinaire, and dismissive of the public's real concerns. And that's the crux of the matter. Reform UK isn't just opposing net zero on scientific or economy. That's where Milliband is losing the battle, not because he lacks facts or vision, but because he's speaking a language that increasing numbers of people no longer relate to. He talks in long-term projections, global commitments, and emissions. Data. Reform talks about heating bills, lost jobs, and government overreach. One speaks policy. The other speaks pain, and that's why Milliband's plea to Reform feels so ineffectual. Telling Farage and Tice to reconsider their net zero position isn't just futile, it's strategically tone-deaf. It ignores the fact that their opposition is not policy-driven. It's politically and culturally deliberate. For Reform, rejecting net zero is a way to draw a line between them and a political establishment they claim has ignored ordinary people for too long. Backtracking now would destroy the very brand they've built. This dynamic puts Milliband and Labour in a bind. Doubling down on net zero risks alienating working-class voters who see it as a financial threat. Backing off would risk revolt among younger, progressive voters who view climate policy as non-negotiable. The party can't afford to alienate either group, but it hasn't yet found a way to satisfy both. So far, Milliband's strategy has been to insist that the green transition will create jobs, boost the economy, and reduce long-term costs. And, in fairness, there's some truth to that. But these benefits are often abstract and long-term. What many voters want are concrete answers about the here and now. How to pay their bills, how to heat their homes, how to keep their car on the road without bankrupting themselves, until Labour can explain how net zero will work for them not just in principle, but in practice. It will struggle to win this debate. Meanwhile, Reform's messaging machine is growing more confident. They know they're striking a nerve. And they're emboldened by international trends, from the backlash to Les in London, to protests in Europe against green mandates, to the election of populist, climate-skeptical leaders abroad. All of it feeds their claim that net zero is a globalist con designed to punish the many for the sins of the few. Milliband might call that reckless. But it's effective, and so, while he tries to shame reform into changing their minds, they are busy convincing voters to change theirs. It's a high-stakes gamble that could reshape the UK's energy policy for a generation. If Milliband wants to turn the tide, he'll need to move beyond lectures and condemnation. He'll need to present a climate policy that isn't just idealistic, but realistic, one that doesn't feel like a moral crusade, but a practical roadmap. That means being honest about costs, flexible on methods, and deeply engaged with the people who've felt left behind, because the truth is, if net zero fails, it won't be because climate change isn't real. It will be because political leaders failed to bring the public with them, and right now, Ed Milliband is in danger of becoming the face of that failure, while reform is fast becoming the voice of those who feel left out of the conversation entirely. This growing divide isn't just about climate policy. It's a test of whether Britain's political class still knows how to listen. Ed Milliband, once seen as a visionary on green policy, now faces accusations of being out of touch. Critics say he's clinging to a net zero narrative that might resonate inside think tanks and university panels, but not in the kitchens and factories where people are worried about the next heating bill, not melting ice caps in 2100. That's not to say people don't care about the environment. Poll after poll shows widespread concern about climate change. But concern doesn't equal consent for policies that feel rushed, unfair, or economically lopsided. And this is where Milliband and Labour are struggling. They've failed to translate environmental ambition into real-world security for ordinary voters. Reform strategy takes full advantage of this. While Labour talks about building wind turbines and rewilding farmland, Reform talks about reclaiming control. Control over energy, over policy, over national destiny. It's a message that echoes the populist themes of Brexit, which still carry immense political weight, especially in the same communities that delivered the Leave vote. This is why Milliband's attack on Reform doesn't land. It's framed in moral panic, accusing them of climate denial, recklessness, even betrayal. But those labels don't scare voters the way they used to. In fact, they often backfire. Too many Reform supporters being called reckless by Milliband or the BBC as a badge of honor. It means they're challenging the very system they believe has failed them. And what's more, Reform is not just a protest movement anymore. It's an electoral force in the making. Local council results, by-election swings, and polling surges all suggest the party is becoming a viable option for millions of disaffected voters, especially those disillusioned with the Conservatives. But unwilling to embrace Labour. In that context, Milliband's warnings sound increasingly desperate. His appeal for Reform to change its stance assumes that this is still a debate based on facts and feasibility. But it's not. It's a political war over meaning, over identity, over who speaks for Britain's future. In that war, data doesn't matter as much as narrative, and Reform has found one that resonates. Still, Milliband isn't without tools. He remains one of Labour's most experienced operators, and if he adapts, he could still shape the narrative around net zero. But it will require humility. It will require shifting from top-down policy diktats to bottom-up engagement. It will require abandoning the assumption that the moral high ground is enough, because if Milliband and Labour fail to reframe net zero as a people-first project, not a technocratic mission, the policy will crumble under its own political weight. And Reform UK, with all its bluster and bluntness, will be standing over the wreckage, claiming victory, and what comes next if they do? A rollback of environmental rules, new drilling licenses in the North Sea, a return to fossil fuel dependency, just as the world moves on. Possibly. But that, too, would be a consequence of Labour and Milliband failing to protect net zero by making it believable and beneficial to voters, not just urgent or righteous. The irony is that Milliband once positioned himself as a man ahead of his time. Now he risks being overtaken by it. Reform has spotted a void and is filling it with a message that, while controversial, has clarity.